One slide.
That looks good. That looks
All
good.
right, great.
So we have a lot of people online, and it looks like there's just a couple of us in the room after all that rigmarole.
I can see one smiling person on the third
Yeah,
row back there.
yes,
Hello, you.
they're very excited to be here.
Well,
Um,
I'm glad you're here.
so yeah, the schedule for this has been a little irregular, and we haven't had a full program yet. So I think that's affected attendance. Let's just give it one more minute, and then see if anyone else comes in. And then if not, we'll just go ahead and start.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Well, I think let's just go ahead and get started because I don't see any sign of anyone else coming. So we have more people online than in the room, but that's fine. So I just want to welcome Ben Marwick, who I've not met in person ever, but is somewhat of a legend in the R community for his tireless efforts to maintain a list of publications, among other things, that include our code. And this has become a very valuable resource in its own right. And well, Ben, of course, has done many other things. That's that's how I got to know his work. So I'm excited to have him here. This is our second attempt at doing this just because of the time zone differences. So I'm very much looking forward to what he has for us today. So Ben, if you want to go ahead and get started, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Look, it's really a great pleasure to join you all and also recognize some familiar faces, so that's fun as well. And really an honor because your program is one I have a huge amount of respect for and really admire and sort of look to see like what kind of cool things is going on at York that we should be doing here at UW. So I'm so thrilled to be here. So, and thanks for noting that list as well, which by the way is something I invite anyone to contribute to. If you find a paper that has R code available with it, please make an addition to the list and keep it up to date. It's it's turned into a really interesting resource. So I want to talk about better archaeology through Bitcoin. So this is like a deliberately kind of irreverent and maybe slightly provocative approach to making archaeology more transparent, accessible, and reproducible. So this kind of motivation is a pretty new line of argument for me, and I haven't really written anything about it or talked a great deal about it. So I'm very keen for your feedback to see whether it's worth to share with another audience or not. So my plan is to look at some recent developments in kind of the sociopolitics of cryptocurrency to get inspiration for the future of open research, the long-term future. That's kind of the clue, my outline, I guess, for open research in archaeology. So I want to get started by turning to a new tool that probably we share a kind of common struggle to make sense of and incorporate into our research and teaching and so on. So let's get some inspiration on how to answer this question from here. Unlikely that Bitcoin could have any direct impact in archaeology. However, blockchain could be used to create a tamper-proof record of artifact provenance. Could be used to authenticate and track movement. Okay, so that's not too ridiculous. Not highly inspiring, but what about this blockchain proposal? We can actually see that someone had a go at this a few years ago. This is 2018 CAA meeting in Tübingen. A group here gave a talk on the blockchain revolution and open data and archaeology, and of course it sounds quite relevant for people interested in open data and so on. But looking a bit further on, perhaps goes in a direction that at least I certainly wasn't expecting very much. So this is a project called Kapu, and it's they propose a coin on a sort of blockchain kind of system, and the idea is that you would have this kind of software on your computer that would be part of a node in this decentralized network and confirm transactions and so on. And some of this would be around tracking artifacts and antiquities and just anything that you like, really. And this project got a lot of positive attention. You can see the Guardian got pretty excited about it as well. And let's see kind of where they went. You can see their social science data revolution sounded pretty exciting. So let's see how they're kind of going. This is the GitHub repository for their node, which is the software that you would download and install and so on. And you can see, not a lot of activity on the GitHub repository. The last updates or anything there 4, 5, 6 years ago. So that is not a good sign of a vibrant project of any kind. Moving along, here's their Twitter account. And you can see the most recent post is they're hawking the non-fungible tokens, this kind of unique digital identifier that probably many of you know a lot about, and a bit sort of scammy. I think it's not looking too healthy in terms of a community around this coin. And finally, we can look at the price of the coin. So that you would buy the coin to get access to their blockchain, where you could then deposit your archaeological data and artifact records and so on. So if their technology is being used, we should see some price action. The coin should have some value. And look at this. It had a little bit of activity, maybe when they gave their talk and the Guardian article came out, and then since 2021, it's been worthless. It's been worth zero, close to zero. So this is not a very encouraging situation. ChatGPT's idea hasn't seemed to have been able to find a successful implementation. And maybe this kind of open source technology around blockchain isn't really what's going to make much difference in archaeology. So we need to look elsewhere to find something relevant to the world of archaeology. Find something relevant to archaeology in the world of cryptocurrency, and this is what I propose. And this is especially timely because this is Sam Bankman-Fried, and he's just been sentenced to, I think it was 100 years in jail. And you probably have heard about this recently, and you might have even started hearing about it around the end of 2022. His firm, FTX, at the time it was running the world's third largest exchange for trading cryptocurrencies. Like, this is a thing like the New York Stock Exchange, but for all kinds of crypto coins. And you can see by the shape of this red line in the background of this graphic here, a massive drop in the value of their own coin that FTX minted. And over $1 billion of normal people's money disappeared as a result of this. The collapse of their firm, their company's filed for bankruptcy, and he's now going to jail. And many of his kind of staff of his company have also been suffering the consequences of their criminal activity. And so while I want to be clear that I think the blockchain and cryptocurrencies, for the most part, for these kind of implementations, are the most pathetic and inefficient system ever invented by humankind for anything, I think the backstory around FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried's kind of motivation is really thought-provoking, and where we can get some interesting ideas about open research in archaeology. So the thread that I plan to pursue just briefly here is around effective altruism. And so I think that's what's unique about this particular bankruptcy, and makes kind of that particular exploration of cryptocurrency relevant to us as archaeologists. And the effective altruism is what motivated Sam Bankman-Fried, the leader of this company that defrauded lots of people. So let's have a look a little bit into effective altruism and sort of see what's in there, what's behind that motivation for him, and what might be of any relevance, if there's any burning embers from this wreckage that we can take inspiration from as archaeologists. And I will try to make the case there is. So before Sam Bankman-Fried got involved in cryptocurrencies, he worked at the Center for Effective Altruism, which is an Oxford-based charity that was founded around 2012 by two philosophy professors. at the University of Oxford, and you can see them up here on the right. This is William MacAskill up here, and down there Toby Ord. And so this is a research field. Effective altruism is a research field and a practical community that aims to, the sort of nominal aim is to find the best ways to help others and put them into practice. And so a couple of key works from this kind of community. MacAskill's book, Doing Good Better, argues that many of the common ways that we think of doing good actually don't do much good. But by applying like data and scientific reasoning to the typically sentimental world of doing good, we can find opportunities to have much larger impact. And so this leads to, fairly sort of reasonable sounding things like, okay, well, we should be giving out a lot of, mosquito nets to people in malaria-prone areas, and then to also to sort of more extreme things like people actually donating one of their kidneys, for example. They feel that's the most optimum way for them to make the biggest difference in their life. So this effective altruism is kind of distinctive from previous forms of altruism because they do quite sort of intensive, quantitative research into what kind of different organizations do. So not only do they investigate like specific kinds of altruism like mosquito nets versus other kinds of things, but also organizations that do that kind of work to see, like, are some organizations more effective in their analysis than others, and what, where should we be donating our money kind of thing to. And so they propose things like, well, you can sort of donate $100 to this charity or $100 to another charity, and one of those, they will try to propose an analysis that finds which charity will produce a greater kind of effect for the interested person. This leads to all kinds of interesting questions about how to maximize or measure maximization. There's definitely a fringe community in effective altruism that have made some pretty bizarre calculations that sort of lead to things like donating kidneys to strangers and so on. But it's mostly pretty normal people, looking for interesting ways to make sure their few dollars of charitable donations, per month, does the kind of good they're expecting it will. So it's for the most part, the mainstream of it is a fairly agreeable, I think, community who are basically sort of, humanitarian with a quantitative bent, perhaps. They're less interested in donating to their alma mater, which might make some small difference to a tiny number of people. These are people more interested in like donating a small amount of money that they hope will make a big difference to the quality of life of a large number of people. And someone like Sam Bankman-Fried is like, well, I'd like to make a lot of money to then make as much difference as I can. Initially, positive difference was his claim. So in this book, Doing Good Better, MacAskill claims that, things like fair trade does very little to help the poorest farmers. Boycotting sweatshops can actually make things worse for the global poor. Mosquito nets, like I mentioned, is actually one of the most effective public health measures according to his measurement. And makes quite an interesting sort of extension of this, like, why should you pursue a high income career? Because that could potentially do more good than charity workers donating large portions of their wealth. So he has this concept called earning to give, which is what Sam Bankman-Fried kind of got stuck into. He's like, well, we could all donate a few hours of our time per week or per month, doing something for a charity, or we could just go all in with an incredibly high-powered, like, 7-figure per year salary career, and then donate a huge chunk of that to our favorite charity. And these kind of, for some people, that will be the most effective way they can make the most positive difference, is to just have a super high earning career and donate large amounts of it to organizations that are going to spend it kind of on their behalf. So this was Sam Bankman-Fried's kind of idea. He was like, I will do this thing, I will make a lot of money on Bitcoin, and then I will donate a lot of it. And so on. And then he obviously got carried away and did some illegal things, and it's all fallen down around him. And this 80,000 hours in the middle here is a non-profit organization that does research into those kind of careers that could have potentially the largest financial impact that you could give away, and also the largest social impact. And the name 80,000 comes from a typical lifetime of a career: 40 years, 50 weeks, 40 hours a week, and so on. And probably if you're like most of you are like me, and you've knowingly chosen a career where salaries, where you're not in it for the salary, they're generally not high, and earning to give is not really a relevant concern, you might find it a bit unsatisfying, this idea of pursuing a high-paying job. at all, because of how they perpetuate an unjust society, and it might seem perverse to sort of tell people to pursue those. But his perspective is that non-profits tend to have a surplus of highly talented people who want to work for them, but these non-profits lack the funds to put these people to work in meaningful ways. So getting those talented people to work in their high-flying law firms or whatever, and then funnel the funds back to the firm, is one way to solve this problem that funds have. So I will move on now to Toby Ord and his book, The Precipice. And so this is a much different topic in the world of effective altruism. And I think one that's quite a bit more interesting, to where the sort of compelling intersection for effective altruism and archaeology could be. And his book is The Precipice there is on the risks that we might face over the next few centuries that might lead to total extinction of humanity. And, the moral significance of safeguarding humanity's future. And some of this leads to I think, quite ridiculous thinking that I will explore in a moment. But some of it also, there's sort of, I think, a meaningful point in there that is quite relevant to archaeologists. Just as we look back hundreds or thousands of years, he is attempting to look forwards. And I think there's something in there for us to engage with. So in his book, he talks about the risk of human extinction due to unaligned artificial general intelligence. And, for me personally, it's quite difficult to imagine that, but he ranks it at 1 in 10 over the next century, higher than nuclear war, engineered pandemics, and climate change. I don't know, difficult for me to follow that. But I think in any case, this kind of long-term future thinking is where I think we can get some interesting inspiration for open research, the future of open research and archaeology, which is something I'm really interested in. And also, I think, by the way, talking about human extinction, there's another relevant alignment with archaeologists there, because we often work on past extinctions of, hominins, like especially the Neanderthals in particular. So we have some experience in thinking about ends of species, and maybe his kind of work helps us think about the end of our own species. And we have some tools, sort of intellectual tools, for making sense of that as well, that I think is useful. So but the moral issue around thinking about the future that I think is relevant to us. Three points in his book here. The first one: future people matter morally just as much as people today. That's quite a provocative and controversial point. I'm just passing it on to you for what it comes in the book. Future people matter morally as much as people alive in the today. Second one: there may well be more people alive in the future than there are in the present or have been in the past. And I will show you a little bit of data, I think, that does make this one a little bit more of a stable claim. And then thirdly, we can positively affect future people's lives. I don't think there's too much controversy about that, but there is a bit of it can be hard to imagine, like, what the magnitude of the relationship between a thing that we might do now versus and the effect it might have on how far into the future and how many people in the future. So just for a little bit of context about the sort of scale of activity of these organizations that are aligned with effective altruism. So you can see this is sort of $500 million here that they're sort of channeling into various activities, animal welfare, and so on. And then these are the kind of organizations that they're involved in funneling money to, so that they kind of have considered that these organizations are highly effective in their sort of quote unquote forms of effectiveness. So it's a big deal, and there are a lot of people moving a lot of money kind of as a result of the sort of research that the effective altruism community is doing. So the emphasis on the long term that we sort of got this hint from Ord's book, and the kind of existential threats to humanity and so on. This was recently explored in the most recent work out of the organization. This book just came out in November, I think, last year. What we owe the future, and I think this is really this emphasis on the long-term future has come to be known as long-termism, and I think this should be of great interest to archaeologists. The book came out just before the collapse of FTX. It was really bad timing from the author, because he was ready to go on, a book tour and do lots of interviews and so on, and then it turned out that his sort of philosophical position was the source of terrible corruption and extreme loss of money for a lot of innocent people. So just to quickly review the book, it presents three forms of long-termism: weak long-termism, and I label them here as a sort of rubric to navigate through it. Weak, strong, and what I will call galaxy brain. So I think weak long-termism is probably the most familiar kind to those of us who sort of live in the normal real world. care about climate change, for example, thinking about the next generation or two, our children and grandchildren, for example. And we can see this is a fairly common, a sort of widely social acceptable view into the future. Lawsuits of children arguing that current government policies have failed to curbing climate change and therefore threatening them, and governments are failing their duty to care to future generations. These get traction, and people generally many people, I think, appreciate that kind of activity. And, we can see analogs of this weak long-termism back in the past, or in ethnographic examples. American indigenous communities have their value systems that, for example, the seventh generation principle, the ancient Iroquois philosophy that decisions we make today should result in a sustainable future 7 generations in the future. So this seems like a sort of natural human sort of look into the future and concern for doing things now that make sense for the future. Related issues like existential threat of great power war and nuclear weapons, which we are talking about far more in the last kind of year or two, I think, than maybe the last decade, certainly since Russia invaded Ukraine, and now Israel and Palestine getting quite hot. And so McCaskill writes that this weak long-termism is a view, that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. And I have a kind of interesting, I feel it's interesting, material culture example of what I think a reasonable way to understand weak long-termism is here, that I think is nice for archaeologists to consider. So this is a musical performance of a piece called As Slow as Possible by the American composer John Cage. And this particular instantiation of it is intended to take 639 years. So the exact length, you can see the score over here, the exact length of the score isn't specified. There are other attempts to do it in longer and shorter times, but this one is kind of a live performance of it, and you can tune into a YouTube live of it, and they just kind of sound a note for a few decades, and then they change the note as the score moves on and so on. So this is something that people can appreciate, literally sort of have a direct positive experience of, and it's kind of, a pleasant community experience of the thing. The next note change is scheduled for the 5th of February 2024, coming up soon. So don't miss that. I think they just move a sandbag from one thing to another. So, that's kind of not too far into the future, I think, and it's basically pleasant and, for the benefit of society kind of thing. So if moving on to strong long-termism, this is where things get a little bit bizarre from my perspective. This is based on the assumption that there are going to be far more people alive in the future than there are in the present or have been in the past. And since there are more people, going to be more people in the future, it follows that the impacts that matter are those that affect those future people. So this is quite sort of interesting proposal. And so we should be looking to securing a decent future for people that will live thousands or millions of years in the future for us. So this is quite unusual. I don't think we have any sort of common instances of this way of thinking, in society or in recent history. And so I think to help us kind of get some perspective on this concept, here's an example, probably the most practical example, I think, that is also nicely kind of material culture orientation as well, of strong long-termism. So this is a clip from a documentary called Containment by Peter Gallison, who's one of my favorite philosophers of science, and you may know of his book Image and Logic, that talks about high energy particle physics, and notes a really interesting transition when physics shifted from image-centric research, like when people looked at things with their eye, like directly into the sky through a telescope, or photographs of things, to logic-centric research, where people read printouts of numbers collected by sensors and instruments. And I think archaeology has some of this image logic transition in various places going on as well. But in this documentary, he's talking about managing the storage of nuclear waste, the long-term storage. And the challenge that you probably all are aware of is that nuclear waste is highly radioactive for 100,000 years or more. So all of the current ways that we have for sort of managing waste and especially communicating about it probably won't work. Like, we can't be sure they're going to work. We can't put up a sign that says, look out, dangerous stuff here, because in 100,000 years, who knows what writing is going to look like, or any kind of what sort of language people are going to speak. So in this image here from the documentary, you see this concept of a hostile landscape, and the hope is that that will communicate people in a kind of, sort of generic, symbolic way, like this is a place you shouldn't go to or shouldn't stay in. And there've actually been a lot of serious policy discussions by various governments around the world about, how to do this. And here's some documentation. This is a report from the U.S. Department of Energy, exploring how to mark locations of nuclear waste storage. And somebody did a kind of literature review that involved, let's look at archaeological sites that have been around for a long time and see what are the qualities that, have made them endure, and how do sort of people perceive that? How do you sort of mark the landscape? And there's a paper this was the one archaeologist who wrote this report for the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's quite interesting, the struggle with how to communicate a message over 100,000 years. Of course, we don't really know exactly, there are lots of burials at Stonehenge, but what are they communicating to us? They're not really clear. And I also am a little suspicious of the archaeological content of this report, like monolithic tomb. I think it should be megalithic tomb, and I think also the location there is not quite right. Not quite right either. Anyway, so this is I think a central question to us in archaeology. It's like, how do we communicate? So not so much how do we make sense of Stonehenge, that's not my main point here, but we do make sense of things in the past, and how do we make sure people long into the future can have a sense of the sense that we make of things? How do we sort of let future archaeologists know the things that we know in some ways beyond when all of the sort of fashionable theories and whatnot have kind of faded? So I will come back a little bit to these more moderate terms of long-termism, but before I do, let's just quickly look at the galaxy brain long-termism. That's finally really the most bizarre and extreme kind of extension of this long-term thinking. And this is the view that we should take big risks to make the very long-term future utopian for those lucky people that will live in there. So according to this view, the key moral priority of our time, it should be to positively influence the long-term future. I don't think this view has a lot of relevance to us, partly because so far into the future, we're sort of not well conditioned to value that. It's very unconventional and quite easy to criticize. So I want to make a distinction between this kind of weak to strong stuff and galaxy brain that I think is a little bit bonkers. Here's an example, I think, another material culture kind of inspired example of this very eccentric and extreme long-term perspective. So this is called the Clock of the Long Now, which is under construction in a mountain in Nevada. And the plan is for this clock to tick once per year with a century hand that advances every 100 years. And there's a cuckoo that is going to come out on the millennium for the next 10,000 years. And so the stated purpose of the people who put together this clock is to impress people about the immenseness of time. So there isn't really an obvious sort of social benefit or a sort of community benefit. It's stuck in a mountain. It's not a thing that people can go and enjoy in the same way they can go and enjoy the 600-year-long piece of music by John Cage. And I think it's quite telling that there's a second clock that's being built by Jeff Bezos, the sort of billionaire founder of Amazon, who's also paying for the construction. So this brings us, this kind of weird clock project and the involvement of Jeff Bezos brings us to a pretty substantial critique of long-termism. It kind of helps us decide like where to draw the line, thinking about the future, and then the really going too far with it. So a rich guy, Jeff Bezos, spending a lot of money on a long-term project that might have some tiny chance of benefiting some number of people in the very distant future. Honestly, it's hard to imagine what benefit will come from a clock buried in a hill. Maybe that just shows my failure of imagination. But the point is, I want to make is that this kind of ethics washing, that we're doing this thing to benefit large numbers of people in the future, I feel is a sort of ethics washing that's quite popular amongst wealthy people in the tech industry. And Sam Bankman-Fried is just another classic example of that kind of thing. We can definitely say that for sure now that he's gone to jail and been found fully guilty of doing illegal things with his crypto business. The basic idea is you can have a lot of money, spend it on eccentric things of no obvious benefit or might even be harmful to people alive today, but justify that by claiming they may have some tiny chance of benefiting some huge number of people in the very distant future. No way to check that, of course. And then you can claim some high moral ground by saying you're doing this huge good. So these people, I think, deeply concerned by their risks of artificial intelligence and so on. But I think that is the way that we can tell that this level of thinking perhaps is not the most fruitful dimension of long-termism for us to engage in. It's ludicrous to chase these tiny probabilities of enormous payoffs. I think we can't really predict what effect our actions will have thousands of years in the future. Not worth to invest in that, and it just seems unjust. All people living in incredible inequality and miserable conditions now. What good is this expensive clock on the hill going to do for them? So I will just go back now to some more reasonable kind of territory in long-termism and kind of motivate, maybe a sort of weak to moderate long-termism thinking, and then go on to explore how archaeologists can kind of practically do something about that if we accept that the long term is something that we should care about. So this is a plot from McCaskill. I think it's pretty good. Maybe some of these, I definitely feel 50,000 is far too late for that. But you get the idea, like Homo sapiens sort of start around here, various things change, and then we're sort of at about here. And he's saying that, okay, we have all of this time ahead of us. This kind of is making the argument that there may well be more people living in the future than there are now, and have lived in the past. And so we need to sort of think seriously about, what are we going to do for them? How can we make our work valuable to those people? He says maybe we could last as long as 1 million years in total. And this is a pretty reasonable estimate, it turns out, looking at like the lifespan of various types of organisms from the fossil record. If we were a diatom, we might have a full 8 million years. But most mammals, it seems, looking at the fossil record, 1 million years is a pretty reasonable estimate. So it could well be that there are going to be a lot more people living into the future, from now into the future, than they have since between now and since Homo sapiens first appeared. So I feel that's fairly compelling that there's a lot of people, a lot of time ahead of us, and we should be sort of doing something meaningful to make our work kind of useful in some ways to them. So I think we have a unique interest as archaeologists, we have a professional unique interest in long-termism. When people ask us, why do you do archaeology? We often say the point is about, to give some positive value to society by learning from past experiences. Oh, yeah, okay, I can skip that. So here, for example, is the Society of American Archaeology, Why Study the Past? And they do say something like, lessons learned from the past can influence and improve things we do today. We study our past to gain a better understanding of who we are and where we are going into the future, right? So even in the SAA, the most conservative of like archaeological communities, they recognize that we do things for the future. And so now I feel the question is like, how far into the future, and what should we be doing to extend the value of our work as far as possible into the future, if we accept a possible million-year lifespan of humans? I agree that's pretty optimistic, given that we are so actively trying to wipe ourselves out in so many other ways. But let's consider that as a possible sort of maximum lifespan. So sorry, was there a question?
I think someone has their microphone open, that's all.
Oh, okay, no problem, I'll carry on. So, and what I quite like about this approach for archaeologists, kind of long-term thinking, like, is our professional work in many cases is going back like hundreds of years, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe 1 million or 2 years for some researchers. And I would call this, just to put it into context here, a retrograde long-termism. We have a long-term approach about back in time, right? So we behave in a way, our professional behaviors value, put a great deal of importance on the long term, but just in the past backwards. And embodies a perspective that material traces of human activity can benefit human activity, can benefit human society in the present and also somewhat in the future. And I think what this kind of long-termism perspective suggests is like, let's sort of point the archaeology machine in the other direction and imagine how material traces of human activity could be useful in the future, and project meaning long into the future. I think this is our retrograde long-termism is kind of a part of the key ethical motivation for doing archaeology, and also other deep time disciplines as well. And so our stance that the past contains value for the present, it motivates us to transmit that value into the present. And then now I feel we also have, part of our ethical stance ought to be working out how to transmit that value far into the future, since there are going to be a lot of people there who probably expecting to get value out of that stuff. They're going to look back at us and we are going to be their archaeological record, and they're going to be like, what kind of meaningful things can we get from those people to benefit our society? And I think, as a discipline of archaeologists, just for reasons that narrow in on our own kind of community, like we don't leave very much behind for future archaeologists to make sense of. This is a rather fun kind of life-size diorama of an archaeological excavation in a museum in Taiwan. But these kind of like museum exhibits and sort of collections of tools and knickknacks of our own work, not really much, I don't think. I think we can do a better job of transmitting value from our current work long into the future, to generations of unborn archaeologists. And so my question is, like, what kind of material traces or digital traces are we leaving for those huge numbers of future people that will exist over the next sort of 500,000 years, if we be optimistic? And I think our current norms of how we work are kind of paradoxical, given our like professional situation and ethics and how we value material culture and retrograde long-termism. I think what are we going to? We should. We're not leaving much. So collection of garden tools, stationery, and laptop. And I think the archaeology of archaeology is a pretty sparse record for the most part. And I want to ask, how can we improve this? We could go. This is probably the galaxy brain long-termism option for an archaeologist. If that's galaxy brain long-termism sounds appealing to you, this is what you are probably thinking. You will write down your next publication on a sheet of gold and launch it off into space and hope that some kind of intelligent community of organisms finds it and gets value out. But this is clearly a bit ridiculous. We need a more practical approach. And I think we're in a pretty good situation now, particularly the last 5 to 10 years, where a range of tools and services have become available that can help us not launch our work into space, but launch it into a reasonably long-term future and extend the value of it into future generations of archaeologists that haven't been born yet. So I got three kind of answers or three approaches to tackling this question, like meaningful ways to give archaeology this kind of long-term future that isn't too ridiculous, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of, well, some of you may find this ridiculous, and I will be very interested to know that for sure, but not quite as ridiculous as the galaxy brain long-termism that is clearly being entertained by people with a lot of money currently. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm sure you'll find some of these familiar, but I want to sort of share some of my perspectives on them, just to sort of clarify what I think are really productive ways to engage in some of these things. Because if you've heard of these things, you may feel like, oh, that is not something I can do, or there's something bad about it, and I will try to kind of motivate you and dispel the bad things, hopefully. So open access, probably the best known, the thing that most people first think about in the world of sort of doing things openly and accessibly and so on. But it's unfortunate that also you probably are thinking very expensive fees to participate in open access, and also annoying mandates from funding agencies. And so it's unfortunate that these kind of dominate open access, because there's still some pretty good options that cost nothing to the author and satisfy mandates and are pleasant to participate in. So here's the kind of workflow. Submit your paper, and many of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. Submit your paper to a publisher, peer review goes on, accepted by the publisher, eventually published in a journal or a book and so on. And you have a couple of options for going out to a preprint repository, which gives you open access in a pretty low, usually free to low cost way. Notice how I'm not saying anything down here about paying the journal a large amount of money for the APC. I'm saying, no, go to deposit your preprint in a non-profit kind of community organized repository, of which there are several, or your university repository. Another great option, get something like a DOI. That's a great sustainable thing. And I've kind of signified at this point, this is a thing that people do, literally preprint their paper before the peer review process. But I do have a little danger sign here, and you probably are all familiar with the recent let's call it a scandal with Homo naledi and the burial and the art and so on, and many people feeling deeply unsatisfied that paper wasn't, or the papers weren't peer reviewed, and they sort of seem to have just appeared in a fairly, a way that wasn't very compelling to most people. So I'd say I would hesitate to do that unless you know that you have a fairly uncontroversial paper, or you've kind of workshopped it and it's not likely to change very much. I would generally suggest going out to preprint after peer review and revisions, and you've got a bit of risk reduction occurring. Like, okay, so this is probably pretty, 99% the final version of the paper. Get that onto the preprint repository there, and then go ahead and publish in the wherever you like, in a non-open access journal or paywall one, whatever you've got a version of it out here where people can access. So this assumes, of course, the author has some say about that. So I would just quickly survey good and bad options for doing open access to kind of just go beyond the kind of expensive journal APC. So here is a couple of preprint archives that are non-profit, kind of community organized, and very accessible to archaeologists. You probably are familiar with these, I'm sure. And here are the ones that I would recommend not to use at all, although I recognize that many archaeologists do use them. But these are commercial projects, and they're festooned with advertisements and harvest personal information, and there's no guarantee that your paper will live there for very long. These services on the left have made kind of formal commitments to long-term availability of their work, and these other ones here, stuff appears and disappears kind of randomly, and they occasionally get massive takedown notices from publishers that causes things to disappear. This is a particularly fun experiment in peer community in archaeology, in providing a peer review kind of layer or experience to a manuscript that's on a preprint server. I won't talk any more about it, just to sort of tell you that it's there. It's based in France, and with a much bigger community, peer community in ecology and other kind of natural science field. There's a group of archaeologists and it's working really well. I really feel it's an exciting kind of combination of the thing that people kind of crave, peer review, and preprints sort of breaks us out of the kind of grip of kind of the big publish world. So things to consider when planning open access: check with co-authors. I found not all my co-authors are terribly keen about it, and are perhaps a bit worried about people looking at the version before it's actually published, even when there's virtually no change between that. But I would prioritize a relationship with a co-author over something like open access. I will just wait or not do it if they say, no, I find it too alarming. So wait until you're comfortable or your co-authors are comfortable, and get value of it. So when the preprint is out, do share it or cite it. Even I've been very satisfied to see some of my preprints cited before, like 6 months before the final thing is published. So that's a great way to get some value out of it. Second kind of major area, and now we're moving into something that's perhaps a little less familiar to most archaeologists, I think, this area of open methods. And so this is about exposing more of our analytical pipeline to the community, to the reader, especially if our journal articles. So they have a better chance to reproduce our results if they want to do it themselves, or extend it and reuse it onto their data. And this iceberg is a popular metaphor for this challenge. The paper has a couple of lines that describe what we did, but really all of the essential details for someone else to actually do it, like what version of software were they using and what parameters were applied, is not available typically in the paper and kind of hidden. And so the below the waterline stuff is what a researcher needs to know often to have a good chance to use our methods, especially computationally intensive ones, but typically not, hard to squeeze into a journal article just because of the limited space. So here's a little bit of guidance on, doing open methods. Use an open source software. So R, as you heard, as Peter was saying, is one I'm particularly enthusiastic about. Python is another one that has some use in the archaeology community. In the long-term future, thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, no one is going to use R or Python. They'll use something else. But the main thing is that it should be an open source project where we can see what is happening at every level of the kind of calculations, rather than pointing and clicking. Sharing that code. And so we can share code actually in much the same way we can share a preprint. These non-profit kind of community-run repositories are places that can take code files too. And here's one that perhaps is a bit surprising, is having it treated like a first-class research product. So as you submit a work for peer review, like a journal article, asking the cover letter to have the code reviewed as well. Some journals, mostly natural science journals, have this as a normal part of their publication process. And some archaeology journals are kind of getting into it a bit. I know I've had a few journals ask me like, well, we had the author especially request someone look at the code. Would you mind looking at the code? No, I love it. Of course, I feel it's very meaningful, professional service activity. So I think it's appropriate for us to ask for that ask it for it to be done and ask to do it. So if we are the peer reviewer, I will say, oh, I see the author is using R, I would like to see the code and try it out, and so on. I think this is a meaningful way to get value and transmit value out of it as well. And so here's a workflow of a journal. This is a journal of water quality research, their workflow where they have someone, an associate editor, checking reproducibility and sort of making sure the code works. And another program called Code Check, it's a bit of a lighter review process. And this is an archaeology article, the only one I'm aware of that actually went through this Code Check process. So this is a thing, these are things that sort of community initiatives that exist that we can readily kind of take on and apply and ask for. And I've had a pretty satisfying summer contacting journal editors, a bunch of Elsevier archaeology journals and Springer journals, proposing this model over here, this kind of workflow, like you guys should have a associate editor for reproducibility. And even better, most archaeology journals have a person already on the editorial board who has the skill, I believe, uses R and so on, to do this work. So it's simply a matter of just deciding this is a valuable thing to do. And I feel a few journals are kind of on the cusp of it with a bit more nudging might get there. And here's an example. Oh, so Peter mentioned about, we were talking about surveys as a thing that some of you are involved in and work with frequently. So a particular example of demonstrating open methods with a survey project. So this is something we did as part of the SAA's kind of review of their principles of archaeological ethics. They designed a survey, an entirely kind of qualitative thing, a lot of free text entries and so on, people asking questions and writing kind of, sentences to paragraphs as responses. And we summarized the finding. We used the most sort of combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis. And of course, the quantitative analysis, we could make fully reproducible and fully open as well. Of course, we anonymize the responses as much as we can. And so you can see that this is a topic model that has identified the dominant topics that people are responding to in some of their free text answers there. And here's the R code part of the R code that we use to do that. And we can also do some sort of sentiment analysis and of course analysis of the Likert responses, like strongly disagree and highly disagree and highly agree and so on. So it's quite practical, I think, to extend open methods into many areas of archaeology, even ones that are not sort of traditionally computationally intensive. We use this survey here and the free text, unstructured text data, and we were able to apply some reproducible methods that we've made open as well. And we've been using some of this methods we're developing on subsequent surveys for other things too. Oh, another reason why we should consider open methods, I think, and this is probably a slightly more urgent thing, so it's convenient to have open methods for sharing and not having to reinvent the wheel and so on. But check this out. I recently had a look at a large number of p-values, statistical test results from 5,000 articles in the Journal of Archaeological Science, and I just have also looked at the JASR to see how it compares, but I'll save that for another time. And I was particularly interested in p-hacking. People fiddling their results to get a significant result. So here we can see the distribution of these 7,000, p-values. There are a lot of p-values that are very small, and then they range all the way up to 1, of course. But who is reporting very high p-values? Not many people. You can see, now look here, you can see like little peaks in the distribution here. These are presumably rounding, where people just round off to the nearest hundredth there. And the question is like, okay, p-hacking, excuse me, here's 0.05 here. Now, are we getting more p-values just under 0.05 than we would expect? That would be a bad sign. That would indicate that people are maybe selectively reporting results, or they're rounding down the p-values, or they're like dropping stuff out of their sample until they get a significant result. So let's zoom in on this 0.05 and see what is going on. And you can see here, this is a test, a statistical test as well, called the caliper test, that's been widely used in psychology. They have a terrible problem of p-hacking, and so do we. Look at this. So these are a huge number of p-values, just under 0.05. So this caliper test just compares that it's a binomial test for the number of p-values down here, like just under 0.04 and just under 0.05. They should be roughly the same if everyone is behaving well. But in fact, a lot of people are behaving quite poorly and kind of doing suspicious things to get their p-values down there. I think if we were a bit more open with the kind of methods, and I will talk about the data, of course, in a second, this might disappear as people realize that they're going to be sprung. Like they can't get away with p-hacking because people will just be able to see it and and check it in the peer review process and say, well, that doesn't add up.
Right. But we're starting to run out of time.
Okay.
Maybe if you want to wrap up shortly so we can have
Yes.
questions.
Yes, no problem. All right. Yeah. Okay. Let me skip. This is a good point for me to move right at the end, because I think open data is it's probably the most widely known concept. So I will jump directly to the conclusion. I don't feel that will there we go. Good. Yeah. Okay, so what does all this mean? We have these quite nice like tools and services and community initiatives that I feel can make a great difference, that are, not widely embraced by archaeologists. We have a kind of philosophical movement that is, I feel, attractive and a meaningful motivation for thinking perhaps a bit further into the future than we do currently. And then we have these kind of tools for projecting or preserving our work into that domain. Implications for us right now, and I think it's quite it's sort of exquisite to be sharing this implication, particularly with you all, because I think you are like perhaps the best example, the University of York, one of the best examples of having realized this implication. So, in our undergraduate and graduate training, we have this concept of the T-shaped researcher, where we give someone sort of, some breadth, but not wide breadth over a wide variety of topics. And then we make them kind of dig very deeply on the, a collection of Viking belt buckles or something like that in their PhD or whatever. And I think the implication of, that we have an ethical imperative to extend the value of our work long into the future for generations of unborn archaeologists requires that we get comfortable and familiar and develop some skill in data science. And you may have seen a similar version of this, that is the pie-shaped researcher, which has a whole leg of this character way down the bottom here. And I did show that once or twice in a few talks, but people objected bitterly because they felt like there's no way we can spend all that time on our Viking belt buckles and then a whole nother PhD on data science. So I found a character, the Greek gamma, that suggests something of an investment in data science, in working with open source programming languages, and getting familiar with using repositories, in getting comfortable with working with data using open formats and archiving it for long-term accessibility and so on. I think we can say, this requires a greater investment than what we currently do, than what is normal for just our breadth, but not the same investment that we're spending on the 3 Viking buttons that make our PhD. And I think it's programs like yours that have, dedicated tracks in data science and an appreciation, and, scholars who are dedicated to, openness in various kinds, that are like exquisitely placed to prepare future generations of archaeologists to do work that is valuable, like well into the long term. So thanks very much for all of your good work, and thanks for letting me share this thought with you.
Great. Well, thanks very much.